The three of us would like to share some of what we experienced and what we learned on a recent study tour focused on civil rights. Jinx traveled last November, and Susan and I took the same tour in February. We spent 6 days on the ground in Atlanta, Montgomery, Selma, and Birmingham. We were busy all day, every day, with lectures and guided tours focusing on the history of enslaved people and on the important events in the struggle by African Americans to attain their full rights as citizens of the United States. Because there is so much to talk about, we are highlighting only those places where we learned the most or which had the most profound emotional effect on us. Like most of you, we lived through what is called the civil rights era, and we have read a lot about it since. But we all were amazed at how much more there was to learn when you delve deeper into each event. We have a few slides to show while we talk. They don't cover everything because in some museums we could not take photographs, and in other places we were just too immersed to remember to pull out our cameras. We'll start with Susan and Atlanta.
In Atlanta, we visited the Martin Luther King Jr. National Historic Park. This is an area of about 2 blocks in the Sweet Auburn neighborhood, which was a hub for Black development. And you can see some of the houses that have been retained and preserved in that neighborhood right here. We saw a number of sites, but the interiors were closed due to the pandemic. We saw the King birthplace. This is a home owned by his maternal grandparents. When he was born, King was named Michael King, the same name as his father, who was minister of the Ebenezer Baptist Church. In 1934, the church sent King Sr. on a trip to Germany for the meeting of the Congress of the Baptist World Alliance. King Sr. also visited sites associated with the Reformation leader, Martin Luther. On returning home in August 1934, King Sr. changed his name to Martin Luther King and his son's name to Martin Luther King Jr. In 1960, King Jr. joined his father as co-pastor of the Ebenezer Baptist Church, which you see here. But the original church is now a museum. In 1999, a larger building was erected and is used for worship by a congregation, which is very large, about 6,000 people. And it is led by Dr. Raphael Warnock, also a Georgia senator. We walked through the Rose Garden and we saw a statue of Mohandas Gandhi. King admired and adopted Gandhi's nonviolent protests. Finally, we saw the Martin Luther King Memorial, the burial place for Martin and Coretta Scott King. It has a reflecting pool and a waterfall. In the same area is the small Apex Museum of the African Experience. This is Atlanta's only museum solely dedicated to telling the story of African Americans. It houses exhibits on Africa, the slave trade, and contributions by African Americans to America and to the world. It also has a special section on African American women in science, technology, engineering, and math. And here you see Dr. Shirley Ann Jackson, the first African American woman to receive a doctorate from MIT. And she is currently president of the Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in Troy. Another prominent woman is Alice Ball. In 1915, she earned a master's degree in chemistry from the University of Hawaii. She was the first woman to graduate from there. She was a chemist and a pharmaceutical researcher, and she developed an improved method for treating leprosy. Also featured was Euphemia Hayes, She was a Smith College graduate, and she earned a PhD in mathematics from Catholic University. And she was the first African-American woman to earn a PhD in mathematics. She was a leading educator in Washington, D.C. From Atlanta, we moved to Montgomery, Alabama. There we saw the Rosa Parks Museum. In December 1955, she was arrested for refusing to give up her seat on a city bus to a white man. Now, I learned a lot about Rosa Parks from this museum. She was an officer of the NAACP. She had attended a workshop for social and economic justice at Tennessee's Highlander Folk School. She reminisced about her time there and her pleasure at having meals prepared by white folks, which was a new experience for her. Now, at the time on the city buses, Black people were required to pay the driver at the front of the bus, then get off the bus and go around to the back door to enter. And the museum contained a 1950s era Montgomery city bus and a filmed recreation of the incident on the bus. Parks was sitting in the front row of a middle section of the bus open to African Americans if seats were vacant. But after subsequent stops, the whites only section filled and a white man was left standing. The driver demanded that Parks and 3 others in that row leave their seats. While the other 3 eventually moved, Park did not, and she accepted arrest. The NAACP had been hoping to find a courageous person to become the plaintiff to test the segregation laws, and she became that plaintiff. At the same time, the Black population of Montgomery determined to boycott the buses starting on the day of Parks' trial. Participation in the boycott was much larger than the community had anticipated. So in order to manage the boycott, some ministers and the NAACP formed another group, the Montgomery Improvement Association. They elected a 26-year-old new minister of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, a man who was new in town, but he had great public speaking ability. You may have guessed that man was the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. Here is the interior of the church, which was organized by 1877 by freedmen. And here is his home, which was bombed during the boycott. The boycott lasted for more than a year before the bus company changed its practices and the Supreme Court ruled that bus segregation was unconstitutional. Now, like some of you, I recently saw the film, Who We Are, A Chronicle of Racism in America. It included a document created after the end of the boycott with advice for Black people about how to behave on the newly integrated buses. I can recall such instructions as, do not sit next to a white person unless there are no other options. Do not initiate conversation. If you do speak, do so quietly. So even in their newfound freedom, Black people were constrained and careful not to offend white people.
The Freedom Rides Museum is within the original Greyhound bus station, where 21 Freedom Riders were violently attacked with chains and clubs by a white mob of 300 segregationalists when they arrived. Many of us remember seeing horrific photographs of John Lewis and others beaten here on May 20th, 1961. The next night, college students gathered at the First Baptist Church, where a violent crowd of 3,000 white supremacists surrounded the sanctuary, threatening to burn alive those trapped inside. Dr. King notified Attorney General Robert Kennedy, who convinced Governor Patterson to declare martial law, using the National Guard to protect the nonviolent civil rights activists. These events caught the nation's attention at last. The Freedom Rider campaign began in Washington, D.C. on May 4th, 1961. It set out to test compliance with the 1960 Boynton versus Virginia decision at bus stations across the South. This Supreme Court decision desegregated interstate transportation facilities, citing the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Over the summer, more than 400 Black and white students participated in 60 bus trips. This poster in the museum shows Freedom Riders as they were imprisoned. As you can see, the riders came from throughout the United States. The Civil Rights Memorial, created by Maya Lin in 1989, is sponsored by and is in front of the Southern Poverty Law Center. The SPLC began in 1971 and is a nonprofit 503c3 legal advocacy organization specializing in civil rights and public interest litigation. The magnificent Black granite memorial consists of a 40-foot-long curved wall with a thin sheet of water flowing over Martin Luther King's memorable quotation from his "I Have a Dream" speech, a paraphrase of Amos 5:24. In front of the curved wall, a large round granite tabletop, reminiscent of a sundial, has water bubbling up in the center and flowing over the sides. Inscribed on the tabletop are major events of the civil rights movement and the names of 41 martyrs, men, women, and children who were killed in the struggle. This was a moving reminder of what has happened during my lifetime. National Memorial for Peace and Justice, commonly known as the Lynching Museum, opened in 2017. It was developed through the efforts of the nonprofit Equal Justice Initiative organization, founded by Brian Stevenson in 1989. The purpose of EJI is to provide legal representation to indigent defendants and prisoners who may have been denied a fair trial. They have continued this important work while researching for and developing this memorial and the Legacy Museum, which opened last fall. The open-air structure, which contains these hanging monuments, sits atop a 6-acre hill overlooking downtown Montgomery and the Alabama State Capitol. There are 800 steel monuments, one for each county in the United States, where documented racial terror lynching took place. The EJI has identified 4,400 African-American men, women, and children who were lynched between 1877 and 1950. Names and dates are inscribed on each hanging monument. Some of the rectangular structures lie flat on the ground and resemble graves. The goal is for individual counties to claim the columns on the ground and erect their own memorials. A number have done so. In addition, EJI is in the process of erecting markers on the sites of all documented lynchings. In America, lynching began as a form of vigilante justice on the Western frontier. And initially, lynching did not mean killing, rather beatings, floggings, and such. However, we now think of lynching as being hanging. It has been used to terrorize, control, and subjugate African Americans. After slavery, Southern white communities continued their racial dominance by the blood and terror of lynching. They were often public spectacles, announced ahead of time with the family of the person being lynched forced to watch, and postcards sold documenting the lynchings. Lynching could include dismemberment and being set on fire, horrific and incomprehensible. I believe this memorial is an attempt to offer white Americans and all Americans an opportunity to recognize our dark history and begin to take steps toward truth-telling and reconciliation. On a positive note, last Monday, March 7th, the Senate unanimously passed the Emmett Till bill, making lynching a federal hate crime, punishable up to 30 years of imprisonment. You will remember Emmett Till was the 14-year-old Black boy who was tortured and murdered in Mississippi in 1955. The first such bill was introduced in 1900. There have been 200 similar unsuccessful attempts until now. While many states have made lynching a hate crime, this federal law includes all states.
No? No. We're delayed.
This slide is of a powerful structure of the group of slaves in chains. There are a number of thought-provoking sculptures and markers at the memorial. Note how the hanging monuments are at the top of the hill. Another portrayal of agony and cruelty. After Congress abolished the transatlantic slavery trade in 1808, domestic slave trading began to flourish. Between 1810 and 1860, an estimated 1 million enslaved people were forcibly transferred from the upper South to the lower South to answer the labor force needed for the thriving cotton production. From 1819 to 1860, the enslaved population increased from 40,000 to 435,000 just in the state of Alabama. Situated on the Alabama River, Montgomery was the key to domestic slave trade. We saw the dock where they landed and the road they were led or dragged up to the court square and the slave auction block, passing the slave pens and warehouse on the way.
From Montgomery, we headed to Selma, tracing backward the 54-mile route of the famous march aimed at drawing attention to the repeated denial of voting rights. Here we see John Lewis and the Edmund Pettus Bridge, site of 3 history-altering protests in March of 1965. They were the culmination of several months of demonstrations, all of which were met with violence by the notorious Sheriff Jim Clark and his brutal police. Selma was chosen for this confrontation because it was the seat of a county where over half the voting age population were Black, yet only 2% of the registered voters were Black. This was a result of poll taxes, intimidation, and ridiculous and capricious literacy tests with esoteric questions about the Constitution, or questions like, how many bubbles are there in a bar of soap? On March 7th, 600 marchers led by John Lewis and Hosea Williams started over the bridge. Martin Luther King was not there, although previously he had been active in the area in support of voting rights. As peaceable marchers came over the crest of the bridge, they suddenly faced a wall of armed men. The sheriff and his mounted posse men, along with state troopers, all of whom attacked. The peaceable marchers were beaten with nightsticks and whips, gagged by tear gas, and trampled in what came to be known as Bloody Sunday. Newspaper and television images of the violence and the submissive marchers flashed around the world. 2 days later, they tried again. Martin Luther King was there along with many others from all over the country as a result of the widespread publicity. This time, 2,000 marchers crossed the bridge, but again, they encountered state troopers. Fearing a trap, Martin Luther King and the others knelt down to pray and then dispersed in what came to be known as Turnaround Tuesday. For the third try, 2 weeks later, President Johnson federalized 1,900 Alabama National Guard and sent 2,000 additional soldiers and dozens of FBI agents and federal marshals to guarantee the safety of the participants. And here in the picture, you see some of our group walking over the bridge, which was a real thrill. The eventual 4-day march from Selma to the state capitol in Montgomery began with 4,000 marchers, but swelled to 25,000 as they arrived at their destination to press for voting rights. And that August, President Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act, which outlawed literacy tests and challenged the use of polls. From Montgomery, we drove to Birmingham, which in the mid-20th century was well known as the most segregated city in America. It was founded after the Civil War, and it grew amazingly fast because the three main ingredients of steel were there: iron ore, coal, and limestone. It was also a railroad hub. We are looking at the 16th Street Baptist Church, a formidable building. By the early part of the 20th century, this church and many others anchored an extensive Black neighborhood and business district. African Americans established their own retail, social, and cultural centers here. Black-owned banks, mortuaries, movie theaters, and nightclubs flourished. It was a thriving middle-class area. But the people here did not want segregated schools or segregated transportation. They did not want to be second-class citizens. In the 1950s and 60s, a series of protests were organized by fearless local preacher Fred Shuttlesworth. Martin Luther King was called to help several times and ended up in jail, and you all know of his famous letter from Birmingham jail. In all cases, sit-ins and peaceful mass marches were met with police repression, tear gas, attack dogs, fire hoses, mass arrests. Over several months, in fact, over 3,000 people were arrested. And most of these were high school students who were there in place of their parents, who would lose their jobs if they participated. This was the home of the infamous Sheriff Bull Connor, a rabid segregationist who overreacted to every situation and who was in league with the Ku Klux Klan, as were many Southern sheriffs and governors. The protests culminated in 1963 at the 16th Street Baptist Church, where in September of that year, members of the KKK planted 19 sticks of dynamite, causing a powerful explosion that killed 4 little girls and injured dozens more. It was a crime that shocked the nation and got the attention of powerful political figures. These girls are commemorated diagonally across the street in Kelly Ingram Park, where many times in 1963, children and teenagers peacefully marching were met with powerful water cannons, tanks, and vicious police dogs incited by Bull Connor. And here's the sculpture in the park of the 4 little girls. The park is now also filled with sculpture depicting some of the terrible events that took place. The growing recognition by all Americans of these struggles of African Americans, plus a new president in late 1963, led to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibited discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. Nearby this park is the Civil Rights Institute, which documents the events of the 1950s and 60s in Birmingham. It's a research center that promotes the understanding of the significance of the civil rights struggle right up to the current day. This is one of the many museums and memorials we visited that are bringing into the open our country's terrible legacy of slavery. I was gratified that at least some people and some institutions in the South are willing to admit how bad slavery and its aftermath were, and are trying to educate others about it. They are publicly confronting the truth about our history. That is restorative truth-telling in the mode of Germany's stumbling stone reminders of the Holocaust, or South Africa's truth and reconciliation process, and more recently, Rwanda's willingness to confront its genocide. You have heard about many of the places we visited, but now we turn to the experience that was the most impactful of the whole trip. Back to Montgomery and the Equal Justice Initiative's Legacy Museum, an immersive and overwhelming experience for anyone who goes there. Its main goal is to make people aware that slavery did not end. It evolved into lynching, segregation, racial hierarchy, and mass incarceration. We would like to share some of our impressions of that amazing museum.
The museum is located on the site of a former warehouse where Black people were forced to labor. It's also near the site of a prominent slave auction. The museum is huge. It contains interactive social media, sculpture, videos, and very compelling visuals. Its exhibits are totally immerse visitors in the experience. We experience the sights and sounds of the slave trade, racial terrorism, the Jim Crow South, and the world's largest prison system. These are all parts of racial injustice, much of which has gone unacknowledged. Some of the specific things we saw included actual signs and notices collected from around the country that barred Black people from public access. A list of laws and statutes that demonstrated in the US, we had our own form of racial apartheid. It wasn't limited to South Africa. And there was a wall full of jars of soil gathered from lynching sites, displayed with the victims' names. The Historical Marker Project erects narrative markers in public locations describing violence, today widely unknown, that once took place at these locations.
The Legacy Museum was the combination of all we had seen on our trip and much, much more. Other stops were intimate, discrete parts of the puzzle of history. I found the Legacy Museum to be emotional and overwhelming at times. I was completely immersed from the very beginning. Silently standing with others in a large, darkened room, watching huge waves projected on all of the walls, sounds of water, and a slow-moving line of facts circling the room with the unbelievable number of 10.7 million slaves brought west during the transatlantic slave trade. The huge numbers drowned along the way, with others dying on the ships, an estimated 2 million. I felt like I was in the water on the ship. When we then walked on a gravel path between exquisitely molded heads of African men, women, and children, lying on what looked like the floor of the ocean. I was mesmerized. The use of technology was amazing throughout all of the exhibits. One could see and listen to holograms of slaves in individual slave pens telling their stories. I also experienced the grams of more recent prisoners and listen to their stories. The museum describes so many incidents, so many facts. There are more than I could handle or absorb. I did not complete it, but I wanted to. I had lost track of time and had to leave to join my Rhodes Scholar group. I'm so thankful to EJI for making this history so accessible for a mere $5 fee. Everyone needs to see this museum. Strike that. Experience this history.
I agree. I was able to spend 5 hours in the museum and felt that I barely scratched the surface. One of the many things I learned more about on this trip was Reconstruction. It was a time right after the Civil War when the 13th Amendment to the Constitution had made slavery illegal, and when the federal government guaranteed the rights of freed slaves with federal troops stationed all over the former Confederacy. Many freedmen got to school for the first time. 2,000 Black men were elected to local or state office, and 16 served in Congress. Things were better for former slaves, but conditions were not what they should have been. Lincoln's successor, Andrew Johnson, was a Southern sympathizer, and he issued sweeping pardons to thousands of Confederate officials and generals. These people did not give up their dream of a white-dominated South. They found ways around the law, and it was during this time that the Ku Klux Klan was founded to intimidate Blacks. Ulysses S. Grant's 8 years in office were a brief respite, but then a political compromise was made to get Rutherford B. Hayes elected president in 1876. And that compromise brought the end of Reconstruction after only 12 years. Federal troops were pulled out and things went back to almost what they had been: rigid segregation, violence, disenfranchisement of Black voters, and relegation to low-wage farm jobs and domestic service. But there was something else, something that has been described as slavery by another name, and that is convict leasing or forced penal labor. The 13th Amendment should have read, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction." But what it did say was, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted." And that was the out. African Americans were picked up on the street, charged with vagrancy or loitering or walking on the grass, convicted in sham trials, and sent to jail or prison, from which they were rented out to private companies for labor in mines, quarries, railroads, and plantations. The rent was trivial. Formerly, if you owned a slave, you had a large capital investment in that slave. The purchase price was usually hefty, so you took care to keep him healthy enough to work. But if you were only renting a being that you believed was subhuman, you might choose not to feed him properly, or you might deny him medical care. If he died, you didn't lose much, and the jailer or warden didn't much care either, just one less mouth to feed. So in many ways, convict leasing was more inhumane and dangerous for the victim than slavery. And believe it or not, this practice is still going on in some extent today. After being made illegal in the late 20th century, convict leasing is making a comeback. State-run penitentiaries especially rent out their inmates in this shameful matter. On a slightly more positive note, I was impressed during the trip to learn about Martin Luther King's savvy in terms of public relations strategy. He paid attention to the optics of demonstrations. He and his followers were committed to nonviolence, but he knew that just a quiet march would not attract much attention. So he and his colleagues learned to choose their battles carefully. Selma and Birmingham were chosen for major confrontations, partly because of the predictably excessive reactions of their sheriffs and police forces to peaceful protests. King planned no night marches. Protests were held, quote, in the light of day and with the world watching, unquote. He always alerted photographers in advance, and there were always American flags in view, as if to say, we are Americans too, and we are fighting for our vision of America. We could go on, but it is time for you to ask questions if you have any. We'll stop recording now and open for your comments or questions.